Yeah, I'm smiling now. Okay, so I think we'll go ahead and make a start. For those of you that don't know, my name is Tony. I'm an independent consultant, so I work for myself. I'm based in the tropical paradise that is Wellington. And I see that quite a few others from Wellington are here today. In fact, I'm very impressed with the turnout. I was kind of expecting 4 people today, 2 of whom didn't go to the party last night, and 2 of whom came straight from the party last night. So obviously you're interested in this topic. That's fantastic. So the topic, in case you weren't aware of it, is Azure Active Directory Domain Services and what it can do for you. So the focus is very much on the use case scenarios. Just out of interest, how many of you here today have looked at or tested Azure AD Domain Services? That's quite a few of you then. So roughly about 40%. How many of you are using it actively in production right now? Wow, okay. Do any of you want to come and present the session? I was hoping to get away with pulling the wool over your eyes, but clearly that's not going to be the case. Okay, so in terms of the objectives for today, really want to focus on what the service is and how it works, and how it differs from some of the other alternative options you have in the same space. We're going to look at what features are available now, and we'll talk about now. The product went from public preview to GA earlier this month, just a couple of weeks ago. And then we're going to look at some of the features that are coming up in the future. So the meat of this presentation is really around the use case scenarios when you might want to deploy it. So this slide is all about disambiguation. So in the beginning was Active Directory. And at some point further down the line, so this traditional on-prem AD, some point further down the line, it was rebranded to Active Directory Domain Services. And then the cloud came along, and Azure stood up a service called Azure Active Directory. I can understand the rationale behind wanting to call it Active Directory. Active Directory is an established and strong brand. So kind of get that. Having said that, there's a huge gulf in functionality between on-premises AD and Azure Active Directory. So with Azure Active Directory, it's a cloud offering. It has none of the characteristics, or very few of the characteristics, of on-prem AD. So for example, with the points of convergence are really around, they both support PowerShell, they both do authentication, authorization, and they both contain users and groups. Apart from that, there's not a lot in common. So for example, with Azure Active Directory, there's no group policy, there are no OUs, there's no Kerberos support, NTLM support, there's no LDAP support. It's a modern cloud service. It's essentially identity as a service. and supports modern protocols. So for authentication and authorization, it supports SAML, OAuth, OpenID Connect. For LDAP type access, you don't have LDAP, but can get at the same sort of attributes that you can with LDAP using the Azure AD Graph API. So where does Azure Active Directory Domain Services fit in? And at this point, I can't keep calling it Azure Active Directory Domain Services, so it's a bit of a tongue twister. So I'm just going to call it Dave. So whenever I say Dave, just think of Azure Active Directory Domain Services. I don't think it's going to take off, but if it does, you heard it here first. So where does Azure Active Directory Domain Services, or Dave, fit into this Active Directory space? Well, it's very similar to on-prem AD, except it lives in the cloud and it's provided as a managed service. So it's something that sits in your corner of the Azure cloud. And if you bear that in mind, so it has all the characteristics of on-prem AD, and we'll come on to that in a lot more detail. Oh, sorry, just backing up the truck a little bit. So when I first presented this slide to some of my colleagues in the office, I got to the end and one of the guys said, well, that's all very well and good, but what's this -NE business? And so for those of you that don't kind of talk PowerShell, the -NE is not equal to. So before we dive into the detail of Dave, we're really going to talk about Azure Active Directory in the wider context. And just looking at some of the numbers. So in terms of Active Directory instances in Azure, there are over 10 million of them. So you're a very small fish in a very big pond with your Azure Active Directory instance. And the key statistic for me here is the one in the bottom right-hand corner there, where you've got basically over 1.3 billion authentication requests every day. And that number is just increasing. It's a big service. So if you stand up a tenant in Azure, or if you have an Office 365 tenant, you have Azure Active Directory in the background. I don't know if there was a session on enterprise mobility and security, I think 2 days ago. So you may have seen the slide before. But essentially, how many people here have both on-prem AD and a presence in Azure? Pretty much everyone, okay. So this is a very, very familiar sort of hybrid scenario where you've still got your on-prem AD and a lot of infrastructure in there. You're starting to establish some infrastructure in the cloud. And maybe you're using Azure AD Connect to synchronize your identities and your groups up to the cloud. You also may be synchronizing your passwords up to the cloud. So with that, you get you can leverage the security of Azure AD. You can also leverage the self-service capabilities of Azure AD. So for example, with self-service password reset, gives the ability to obviously change your password and update your password, and then synchronize it back to on-prem. Also, once you have those identities established in Azure AD, you have the ability to hook into Office 365, a range of SaaS applications, and maybe some line of business applications that you've enabled for integration with Azure AD. Another feature in this piece, I guess, is the Azure AD application proxy, which essentially allows you to provide a reverse proxy scenario reaching out to the cloud. So it's a cloud service that essentially acts as a reverse proxy. All of this is background, so we haven't yet got to the kind of meat of the presentation around Azure AD Domain Services. So a lot of where this service is positioned is around moving your applications to the cloud. So there are a couple of different ways in which you can move those applications. First is you could essentially throw out what you have at the moment in terms of your application and replace it with a software as a service or SaaS application. A very good example of that is replacing Exchange with Office 365. And obviously, if you do that, there are certain considerations. You know, that involves a fair investment in terms of time and money. The one in the middle there is talking about rewriting existing applications. So it's very likely that your legacy applications, if you like, leverage Windows Integrated Authentication or LDAP. And to rewrite them for cloud, for Azure AD, where those things aren't supported, you really need to rewrite them to support one of the modern authentication and authorization protocols, probably SAML or OAuth and OpenID Connect. Again, that's quite a significant investment in time, cost and effort. So the third option there, and is one that is probably the most popular at this point in time, is to lift and shift on-premises applications together with the underlying systems into the cloud. So let's have a quick look at a lift and shift use case scenario. So there are a number of tools from Microsoft and third-party tools that make it relatively straightforward to take your VMs from on-premises or even physical servers and move them to the cloud. So Azure Site Recovery is one option for that. There are a whole host of third-party solutions that will help you with that as well. It's a relatively simple operation to establish that. But what are you going to do about identity once they've got there? How are those machines going to be managed? How are they going to be secured? You have none of the domain characteristics natively in the cloud that you're used to having in the on-premises space. So with that in mind, there are two widely used options today for achieving that goal of essentially having that identity in the cloud. So the first one is to throw up a VPN connection or an express route connection from your on-premises AD up into the Azure Infrastructure as a Service or IaaS space. That's great, but it does make you very much reliant on the reliability and integrity of that VPN or express route connection. The second option is to basically extend your on-premises AD into the Azure IaaS space by moving or putting some domain controllers up there. How many of you follow that model today? So you've got domain controllers in Azure. Okay, not as many as I thought. That is probably considered the most common scenario. So this is where we're starting to sort of move towards what the service, the Dave service is. Essentially, when considering a service, it should be simple. Microsoft talking about standing up the Azure AD domain service is a two-click process. It's actually about 15, but hey, who's counting? So it's a simple thing to set up. It should be there very quickly. It should be highly available, as you would expect. You don't want things going down when you're doing patching. You don't have a single point of failure. It should be compatible. So it should have all of those things that you would expect from on-premises AD. So the group policy, the OU, the Windows integrated authentication, LDAP, Kerberos, all those good things. It should be cost effective. So in an ideal world, it's going to be cheaper to have a managed service doing those things for you than you trying to do it yourself. Either, for example, going back to that, putting your domain controllers into the Azure cloud. And this is where Dave comes in. So basically, one thing I should point out right from the start is that it's deployed into a virtual network. It's enabled for a virtual network in Azure. At the moment, it's only possible to enable a service for a classic network or one that you've defined in the old portal. So the way it works is you basically enable the service for a specific VNet. At that point, in the background, there's a synchronization of your users and groups and the user passwords as well from Azure AD. That is a process that happens automatically. It's not something you need to set up and configure by yourself. So let's have a look at the characteristics of the managed domain. Microsoft essentially provide the service for you. And I just want to stress at this point that it's not an extension of your on-premises AD. It's actually a separately managed domain that Microsoft basically look after the infrastructure for you. So you don't touch the domain controllers. And actually, you don't have any domain admin, enterprise admin, or schema admin privileges in that managed domain. The domain controllers that Microsoft provide are based on hardened templates, so they're essentially secure by default and in alignment with accepted AD best practice. It leverages the underlying fault resilience of Azure, so it has multiple copies of the underlying storage. It also, it's a service that's monitored for you. You don't have to worry about using rep admin and monitoring things and doing health checks and diagnostics. All of that's basically taken care of for you by the service itself. It's backed up and it's monitored. So let's have a look at how it might work in a very common scenario where you've got your on-premises AD still, you may be synchronizing your users and groups and passwords up to the Azure Active Directory service using Azure AD Connect. You can leverage those users and groups in the managed service. So the way it works is basically, as I mentioned before, you've got Azure AD Connect, pushing those identities and groups up to Azure AD, and that's something that you manage. And then in the background, once you've enabled the managed service, there's a synchronization of those same identities, groups, and the user passwords into the managed service itself. So when you look at the OU structure in the managed service, you will see your users and groups from on-prem AD. So yeah, it's a simple deployment. It probably takes all up less than an hour from the point at which you start configuring the prereqs to the point in which the service is available to you. You get a single domain, so there's no concept within the service of having multiple domains or multiple domain forests or multiple forests, for example. Talked about the high availability and the fault tolerance, the automatic synchronization. One key thing that helps you out is essentially once you've got an identity that's synchronized from on-prem all the way through to your managed service, because it's a different Active Directory domain, it's going to have a different primary security identifier, or SID. That's not going to help you if you've done a lift and shift and you've put up services that have access control lists or ACLs that reference SIDs from the originating domain. So Microsoft have taken that feedback. What they do, and they try and they help you with that by essentially inserting the SID from the on-prem AD user principal into the SID history attribute when it's synchronized into the managed domain service. Essentially, it's like traveling with two passports if you're not familiar with SID history. So those ACLs will reference a SID. That SID will be there and present in the SID history, and the users should have seamless access to that resource. It's a very nice feature. Again, all of the kind of characteristics you would expect from on-prem AD, like domain join, Windows integrated authentication, LDAP bind and read. One of the constraints or limitations, if you like, is the fact that LDAP writes are not supported. So that's something that the product group has received feedback on and they're working on. But it's a limitation at the moment. You can enable secure LDAP or LDAP over SSL. And one of the use cases for this is, for example, if you have LDAP clients located elsewhere, either on-prem or maybe in another cloud service like Amazon, you can effectively do an LDAP bind across the internet to your managed domain. So when the preview came out, there were quite a number of constraints and limitations in the product, and I was actually looking at it going, well, actually, is this such a good thing? You know, those constraints are really going to block or limit the use or adoption of the service. The product group has actually been really good at working through that feedback and actively sort of knocking off the features in terms of priority, the feature requests in terms of priority. So one of those was around custom organizational units. Organizations wanted the ability to create OUs for themselves and put in service accounts, for example. Also, you're now able to have a delegated DNS admin rights, so you can set up forwarders and do the normal DNS things in that managed service. There is a constraint around group policy. So with the managed service, you get two GPOs. You get one for computers, and you get one for users, and that's it. You don't have any ability to create different GPOs. So you can do what you like within the two that you get, but those are the two that you get. The rationale behind that was that, has anyone ever done something silly with group policy that's had an impact to operational things? Okay, yeah. Okay. So you know, with a managed service, Microsoft is very keen to maintain the integrity of that service and make sure that it keeps going. With group policy, there is that ability to do kind of silly things that can impact the service itself. So part of the rationale is to say, okay, let's keep it safe and constrain what you can do with group policy. So since the public preview came out probably around a year ago, Microsoft have been enabling the service in different regions. For us here in New Zealand, probably the good news is that although it hasn't reached all the regions around the world, it is in Australia, so it's our closest point of call for Azure. So let's dive into a bit of detail around the networking. So we mentioned that you can only enable it at the moment for a classic VNet. That's fine, but you can do VNet peering or site-to-site VPNs. That allows you basically to deploy infrastructure in different parts of Azure and manage those servers using the managed service. It's also possible to join your VNets together if you've created ones already using the new portal as ARM VNets. So it's possible to join that with a classic VNet. So there are a couple of things that you need to be aware of around the networking piece. So when you define your VNet, be sure that you don't enable the Dave service effectively on your gateway subnet. It's going to cause problems. Also, Microsoft recommend not applying network security groups, so ACLs, on a subnet where you've got the service enabled. That has bad things based on their experience, where effectively they cut people off, or they cut Microsoft off from being able to manage and monitor and upgrade the service, which is not so cool. Right, so let's dive into sort of where you can actually use the service. So the first one is, imagine a scenario in which you have all of your infrastructure already in the Azure cloud in IaaS. At that point, if you have a whole lot of servers in just on their own, you need to define and manage individual administrator accounts for all of those. So wouldn't it be nice if you had a managed service where you could use your delegated admin rights, just a single set of credentials to manage a whole range of machines. You also have the group policy structure to harden those machines and to manage them through the group policy settings. So the second one is all about LDAP. There are a huge number of applications around there, and I'm thinking a lot of Linux-type applications that don't do Windows integrated authentication, but do support LDAP. For authentication there, that's a really good use case scenario where you stand up the managed domain and you allow access to things using LDAP. And of course, I mentioned this before, probably another very common use case is where you have a legacy line of business application that only supports Windows integrated authentication, can't be changed to support OAuth, OpenID Connect, or one of the modern protocols. So sort of getting down towards the kind of more obscure, I guess, use case scenarios. One of them is they worked out that it's quite useful if you've deployed VDI and you want to manage your remote desktop servers in the cloud. You can manage them, join them up, do the group policy thing. There is a caveat around that insofar as the remote desktop licensing server doesn't play nicely with the managed service. So the workaround is to essentially manage that license outside of ADDS. And the fifth one, and this one was a new one to me. Does anyone work with Hadoop and HD Insights? Okay, so it's not going to be entirely relevant. But if you do need to Kerberize your Hadoop clusters, then this is a method by which you can do it, and it's in public preview right now. So I apologize that this is quite a busy slide, and really what it's trying to do is saying, okay, you have the option of deploying your own domain controllers into Azure IaaS. You also have the managed service. So you've got options. Which one do you choose? I've already mentioned that you need to look at things like cost, manageability, and all those things. So if you are considering the managed service, so the Dave service, what are the kind of limitations and constraints? So if we look in the middle column over there, and wherever it says no, those are the kind of limitations that you need to think about when making that choice. So the first one where it says no is, as I mentioned before, you don't have domain or enterprise admins. If that's going to be a big deal for you, then the service is not for you. I think there are a few applications out there that either rightly or wrongly require you to have domain admins as a service account, for example. Those always annoy me, but there are those out there. The next one is around schema extensions. So it's not possible currently to extend the schema within that managed service. Now, how many of you here use Exchange or Office 365? So to pretty much everyone. So, and of those people, how many of you leverage the extension attributes that you get from the Exchange schema as spare attributes? Yeah, quite a few. So that's something to think about if you're doing this at the moment. You can't extend that managed service in the cloud to include the Exchange attributes. So it could impose a limitation or constraint for you. The next thing is you don't have AD domains and trusts. So it just sits there in isolation. And one of the things that the product group is actively working on is the ability to create trusts. And the use case that they primarily see for that is that if you establish a connection between your on-prem AD and the VNet where you've got the managed service, effectively you can use that managed service as a resource forest. So basically you put all your servers in there and you manage everything with the accounts that you have on-prem. And that's a model that people are used to working with. So LDAP Right, they received a bit of feedback on that. And again, that's something they're working on providing. Geo-dispersed deployments. So as I said before, you define the managed service by enabling it for a specific VNet in Azure. So if you had a requirement to have domain controllers deployed at other regions around the world, then this isn't going to work for you because you're limited to that VNet within one region. Another constraint that I haven't highlighted is that it does rely on synchronization of passwords. So if you're an organization that's got a federated model with ADFS, for example, for single sign-on, this is something you need to think about. For those of you that are doing the password sync thing from on-prem AD using Azure AD Connect, you should be fine. So client workstations, is it okay to join those to the managed domain? Well, Microsoft, so basically if you've got Windows 10, then a better option for you would be to do the Azure AD domain join. The reason for that is that it gives you a lot of the management capabilities similar to group policy through Intune and MDM, but also you no longer become reliant on the integrity or availability of the VPN or express route connection from on-prem to the Azure cloud. So let's cut to the chase and find out how much it costs. So it has just hit GA, so this is pricing, is interim pricing until the 1st of December, and then there's sort of pricing more expensive actually from the 1st of December onwards. So if you're looking at, it's based on the number of objects that you have inside the AD in the managed domain. So for New Zealand, I'm guessing most organizations are going to be in that first category with less than 25,000 objects. With that, you're paying around $110 a month. So I don't know how many of you run virtual machines in Azure IaaS, but if you're thinking about running a domain controller there, and actually you probably need two if you wanted high availability in the cloud, it's going to cost you more than $110 a month to run those. And that's not taking into consideration all of the management, care and feeding, upgrade, patches, all those things of those domain controllers. So I was kind of really, really pleased when I saw the pricing come out for GA, because I think as a service, because it still has some of those limitations or constraints we talked about, it needs to be competitively priced to make it attractive for people to move to. So it does go up to $166 a month from the 1st of December, but I think, again, that's still it's still a cheap service. So it's independent to 365. Oh, sorry. Just going back a bit. So the pricing is independent of any of the Azure AD pricing. So with Azure AD, you've got free, basic, and premium pricing. It's independent of that. It's priced separately. So it's its own costing model. It's a good question. Thank you. So, right, with that, I'm going to leap into the demo I have. Because of the way the cables are structured here, I'm going to have to sit down, for which I apologize. Okay, so with this demo, I'm going to run through quickly the setup of the managed service, and then we'll look at how we administer the domain once we've got it up and running. So the first thing you'll see here is that I'm in the classic portal. Probably the biggest piece of feedback Microsoft have around this service is that they want it in the new portal, and they're working on that. As I understand it, the time frame for that is probably towards the end of this year or early next year. So what you see here, I've focused on the Active Directory option. Within that, I've got a number of Active Directory instances. So you've got one here called AADDS Ignite Demo, which kind of does what it says on the tin. We'll nip in there. Is that quite clear for everyone? Yeah, good. I'm going to nip in there, and I'm going to dive into groups. So the first thing you need to do when considering the setup is to define a group for delegated administration. So this is the delegated rights that you will use to manage objects within that managed service, within the domain. So it has a fixed name, so you have to give it this name, AAD-DC admins. So once you've set up that group in your Azure Active Directory, you can drop any number of administrator accounts in there. So I've created a user called Dave Admin, and I've made that a member of the group. So when I log into a management server with Dave credentials, essentially I would be able to manage the objects that I've put in there. So the next thing you do once you've set up that group and populated it is to identify a virtual network to use. So again, you have to define a virtual network using the classic portal, and you have to choose a region for that network that is supported. So again, I don't think that's going to be an issue for us here in New Zealand, because we're likely to choose one of the Australian regions. So we jump into the configuration. You'll see that I've defined this VNet, I've created it, but I've left the DNS servers blank. That's because when I enable the service for this VNet, after about 20 minutes, it's going to start spitting out some IP addresses at me. And those IP addresses are essentially the DNS servers and the domain controllers for the domain. And I'm going to get 2 of them. Oh, sorry. So just going back to the Active Directory instance I've got here. Oh, sorry. Wrong configure tab. So basically on the configure tab, when it's finished loading, you'll see that I've got a domain services option here. And I think this is where the 2-click creation comes from, the claim from Microsoft. So basically, if I click yes on there, it says, great, you want to enable the Dave service for your tenant. It's going to propose the default name for that Active Directory instance. So in this case, it's proposing the onmicrosoft.com domain name. At this point, you don't have to choose that. So you do have the option of choosing a custom name. So essentially, because it's a relatively closed environment, you can choose any name you want. So I can call it dave.com if I want to. Now, you do have to think a little bit about this in that you have the ability to choose the same name as your on-prem AD, and there are some benefits in that. But if you join your on-prem network to this VNet in some way, you need to be careful about name clashes. So generally, Microsoft recommend choosing an independent name for this service. And in terms of the network that it wants, the virtual network that it needs to be enabled for, you have a choice of the ones that you've created in the classic portal, and they must be in a region that the service supports as well. So then, once you've done that, basically you go ahead and click Save. At that point, after about 20 minutes, it's going to spit the first IP address back at you, and in another 20 minutes, it's going to spit the second IP address at you. Once you've got those 2 IP addresses, you go back to your virtual network and type those in as the DNS service for that VNet. And that's it. So sort of end-to-end, once you've sort of done all that, it's really taken no more than an hour to stand up the managed service, which is cool. So here's one I prepared earlier. So you can see quite clearly that I've got my own name, which is dave.contoso.com. It's enabled for a specific subnet in the Australia Southeast Azure region. I've got a couple of IP addresses on the 10 network, so these are my DNS servers and domain controllers. I also have the ability to upload a certificate, which could either come from an internal PKI or from an external certificate provider. And that will enable LDAP over SSL or LDAP-S. And then I have that checkbox option about whether to enable that over the internet or not. So that's pretty much it in terms of the setup. Once you've got that, nothing else happens apart from that synchronization in the background between Azure AD and the managed service itself. So your users and groups will be populated. But you actually need to do something next. So basically, in order for you to leverage that domain, you need the tools. So these are your standard AD tools that you work with. So the first thing I'm going to do is basically look at the spit out of IP config. So I've created, hold on. Basically what I have here is a Windows Server 2016 box. There we go. There's a time lag. That I've created and I've joined to the domain. I've then installed the remote server administration tools for AD and group policy. So this, just up on the screen here, is the output of ipconfig. You can see there that quite clearly the DNS servers that are showing are the ones that were spit out for this particular domain. So let's have a quick look at the domain controllers that the service provides. So you can see there in terms of the name, it comes up with a unique name that's randomly created. You have no control over the name of the domain controllers. So even if you wanted to, you can't change it. Again, you have no domain admin rights, no enterprise admin rights. See the domain name there? One of those domain controllers is assigned all of the flexible single master operations roles, so those FSMO roles. And the service itself is based on Windows Server 2012 R2 DCs. So I've asked the product group when we could expect to see Windows Server 2016 DCs. I haven't heard anything back yet, but when I do, I'll share it. So as you would expect, if we look at the forest and domain functional levels, those are going to come back as 2012 R2 as well. So again, there's a consideration there. If you have applications that have, say, they're only supported for specific domain and forest functional levels, then you need to think about whether that's something you want to take on. For example, if they say we only support Windows 2008 R2 mode. Yeah. So there's no, sorry, just the question there was you can have different functional levels on site, so on-prem AD to the one that's enabled in the managed service. So yes, absolutely, that is supported. Oh, good. So who's using the Wi-Fi network? All right. I'll just give it a couple of seconds to come back. In the meantime, has anyone got any questions? Yeah, so I think what we're saying is basically if you have on-prem AD that's running at a different level, one of the benefits, if you like, of this managed service is if you're constrained in terms of upgrading your domain and forest functional levels on site, is a benefit in having the newer functional levels in this managed domain. Yeah, thanks for that. Okay, looks like we're back on track. So I wanted to quickly show you the. Okay, we are a bit slow on the network here. I wanted to quickly show you the domain structure. While we're waiting for that, I'll just talk it through. So essentially, there we go. How many of you are using the Active Directory Administrative Center these days in preference to AD users and computers? Okay, it's been out a while, and it does have a number of features over and above Active Directory users and computers, so I'd recommend using it if you can. So what we have here is the OU structure as provided by the domain service. So you're given a computer's domain and you're given a user's domain. So if we dive into the computer's domain, you can see that I've got one server there, and this is the server that I'm working on, the 2016 server that I've called Dave Demo. If we go to the users, you can see that these are the users and groups that have been synchronized in from Azure AD. So is that delegated administrator group, AADC administrators, and I've got Dave admin, and I've got my own account there. I didn't have to put those in. Again, those were synchronized in from Azure AD. So those two OUs are the OUs that you can use. Everything else is pretty much locked down. So there's one here called the service administrators, sorry, the domain admin group. And this is where Microsoft have essentially given themselves delegated rights to your domain. So you have no control over this group. If we dive into the membership, we'll see that there's one account there, when it eventually rolls over, that has domain admin rights and enterprise admin rights and schema admin rights. You have none of those. That's all delegated to Microsoft. Okay, it looks like we're suffering a bit with the performance of the network. Yeah, okay. So this, sorry. Yeah, so we've got this is the delegated rights from Microsoft. You can see that it's DCAAS admin, which essentially stands for Domain Controller as a Service Admin. And this account has that domain admin, enterprise admin, and schema admin's rights. The next thing I wanted to show you, if the network plays ball, is group policy. And I'll just talk it through while we're waiting for it. So, here it comes. So basically, there are two group policies I mentioned that you have control over. One of those is the computer's GPO, and that's linked to the computer's OU. And the other one is a user's GPO, which is linked to the users OU. So those are the only two group policies that you have the ability to edit. So you can do what you like within those policies, but you can't create new group policies outside of that. You also have a default domain policy and a default domain controllers policy. You don't have any rights over those. So you can view the settings within those, which are fairly limited, but there's nothing you can do with them.
With that, could you use the reference targeting to sort of get around the fact that there's only one GPO for users, one GPO for users? Will that still do reference targeting to security groups, for example?
So the question is it possible to use group policy preferences to get around the constraint of one GPO for computers and one for users? I wouldn't have thought so because of the delegated, the way the OU is delegated as well. So you have permissions for the computers OU and the users OU, but you're not going to get a lot outside that. So I don't think, because of the scope of management, even if you create a custom OU and create objects below that, I wouldn't have thought you'll be allowed to hook those preferences in, because you won't be able to link that GPO to the newly created custom OU. It's worth testing, but that's kind of the way I see it. Thanks for the question. So that was it in terms of the demo. Sorry, say again? Oh, okay, it's a very good question. So the question was, is replication in both directions, so from the domain service back, or just in the direction of Azure AD into the service itself? So it's very much one directional. So synchronization flows from your on-prem AD through AAD Connect up to Azure AD, and then the information flows from Azure AD through to the domain service, and nothing goes back. Okay, good question, thank you. So in terms of the roadmap, and we've touched on a couple of these points, so support for the new portal and ARM and PowerShell, the new PowerShell from ARM and ARM templates, it's coming. It's just not yet there. The product group, as I said before, are very good at prioritizing based on feedback, and so we'll expect to see these features coming very soon. Resource forest deployments is another one we talked about, where the ability to establish trust is really going to help you out in some scenarios. Schema extensions, another one, especially custom schema extensions. And the LDAP rights and the ability to customize GPOs. Notwithstanding the constraint I mentioned about the need for Microsoft to be able to maintain the integrity of the overall service. Okay, so that's essentially in a nutshell what I wanted to cover today. Hopefully what you got from that is when to use the Dave service in preference to sending up your own domain controllers into the Azure IaaS space. I'm around for questions if anyone has any, but otherwise thanks very much for your time this morning.